Hello. Today we're going to look at the early forms of government in our new nation after 1776. So we'll be talking about things like the Articles of Confederation and also the Constitution and kind of doing a civics review as well. So as we go through today's presentation, we're going to try to come back and connect to some prior knowledge, but these are also some great places to be asking questions when you return to class next. So our first national government was a written plan known as the Articles of Confederation. And this plan was one for the purposes of creating a nation in the midst of a revolution. It wasn't necessarily created with the mindset that it was going to have to help unite 13 states once the war was over. And certainly by 1783, when the war is over, we do begin to realize some of the flaws in this original plan. Those flaws are severalfold. One is that you had to have unanimous ratification, and you also had to have unanimous agreement whenever you wanted to add or change the articles. So you can see that it took almost 4 years in order to ratify this Articles of Confederation in the midst of a war. So there were already some issues with the document itself, and then consider that anytime you needed to change further, you weren't going to be able to do that easily. The 13 states did not want to give up too much power and authority. They hoped to really kind of see, almost run themselves as they saw best as a sovereign entity, not really looking to a national government with any power, actually afraid of a national government that would have too much power. So every state, as of 1777, that ratified this document coined its own money, it raised its own individual armies, it created tariff barriers against other states, and could even go so far as to ratify international treaties with other nations. So giving tremendous amount of power to the states and very little power to the national government. The national government could not regulate commerce, so they could not prevent these tariff barriers. They could not make agreements for the whole nation relative to trade with France, for instance. And they also couldn't enforce tax collection. Tax collection was going to take place based on the generosity of a state. And if a state chose not to contribute, there would be no money going to the national government. Probably the one saving grace of this plan of government was the ability to organize future lands in the West. And that's really where we see the value in the articles. In the years following the Treaty of Paris of 1783, we will have two documents, one which divides up land in the West for the purposes of purchase and settlement, and also a document that is going to set up the legal standards, both of which will set in motion the way in which land is acquired and brought into the United States proper, and has been for over 200 years. And also we'll begin to see why there are certain principles that appear in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights that don't appear in the Articles, and their inspiration came from these documents. So Thomas Jefferson is really the main architect of these two documents, the first one being the Land Ordinance of 1785. And it took an area of land known as the Ohio Valley, which included today Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and it was an enormous area of land, basically all that land north of the Ohio River, but south of the Great Lakes. And it was divided up into even lots that provided what would be about 160 acres, with the idea that that could be a self-sustaining farm based on the standards of the day, that you had townships that were already articulated on the map, that in every area there would be land set aside for the purposes of having public schooling. So you can already begin to see what are some of kind of what we would consider sort of middle-class values in American life, even to this day, are established pretty early on. Once that actual physical plan is created, 2 years later, Jefferson develops what becomes the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And this is going to create the process by which these future states can come into the Union. So territories since 1787 have followed this plan. They have to have written plans of government. They have a territorial governor. They have a process by which they get to 60,000 people. They may apply for statehood. They have to present their plan of a state constitution, which has to get the approval of Congress. Every other state in our union since 1787 has gone through this process. It also will start to create the wedges that will lead us on that trajectory to civil war. Slavery will be prohibited in these areas. You also will have a guarantee of freedom of religion. There's no established church, and it clearly says you cannot have an established church. Obviously, the guarantee of freedom of religion we're going to see in our Constitution and Bill of Rights. We won't see that prohibition of slavery for many, many more decades. And you can see here are pictures, the grid pattern that was established with the Land Ordinance of 1785. The one thing that many of the smaller states of the East were concerned about was the idea that you could get some super large state, so something to the effect of what we have with Texas today. And so this area of land, they did not want to ever become a single state. So it was already agreed with the land ordinance that you would have no more than 5 and no less than 3 states. And in the end, you do get 5. And some of them will come into the Union pretty early on, like Ohio and Indiana. Michigan, Wisconsin will come along much later. You can also see here that this grid pattern creates very rectangular communities, pretty evenly divided, whereas you can see the old Eastern Survey here in Maryland, where you have land often running along some natural waterways. They are not evenly distributed. That was something that, especially for the purposes of selling land, sight unseen, it was really important to Jefferson that you had some kind of formal surveying process. And that's why this grid pattern, the square townships of 36 square miles, and then they would be divided up to acres as small as 40. Most people, individuals, would have bought something that was probably 160 acres. Wealthier people, people who were speculating, would have probably purchased the full 640 acre lots that were created. We're also going to see a series of international conflicts come to be. One of those is going to be that Great Britain, once the war is over, wants to get its manufactured goods back on the market. It wants to continue exporting. And although we did require the need for being able to produce some manufacturing on our own during the war, nothing to the effect of what Great Britain had. So after the war, Great Britain floods the American market with cheap goods. Great Britain also refused to send an ambassador. So even after the Treaty of Paris of 1783, they, on paper, formally recognized the United States, but they didn't actually send someone from Great Britain to come and act as an emissary in the United States. Although we had access to the Mississippi River in theory, Spain will end up closing the port of New Orleans to U.S. trade. So in a sense, that agreement kind of goes out the door. France, with the Treaty of Alliance in 1778, has created the circumstance that allows us to prevail and win the American Revolution, but that costs a lot of money. We borrowed lots and lots of money from France, and we are not paying it back in a timely manner. And as you know anything about world history, within another decade, they will have a revolution themselves, in part because of the great debt and other economic problems that that country faces. There was an entire world of piracy that still existed well into the late 18th, early 19th century. The most effective group of pirates was in the Mediterranean. And the Barbary pirates were typically paid off by other nations. It was just seen as the cost of doing business, trading in the Mediterranean. But the U.S. had no money. And so U.S. ships often found themselves being attacked, captured, their crews being kidnapped by these Barbary pirates. And that will be something that will be eventually settled during Thomas Jefferson's time in office. He will actually use our Navy to defeat the Barbary pirates and no longer have this issue, but it will go on for about 20 years after we become a nation. And then the last thing is that you have states that have debt themselves from the war, particularly New England states. They begin to heavily tax their citizens to the point that you had people who would lose their farms, and kind of the same scenario you had back with the regulators in the 1760s and 1770s in North Carolina. So there's lots of conflict internationally. There's lots of conflict within these new states themselves. The most famous of those being Shays' Rebellion, and it's often cited as the reason why we end the use of the Articles of Confederation and create that Constitution of 1787. But Daniel Shays was a farmer in Western Massachusetts, and he, like many people in that area, some of which had actually committed their lives to fighting in the Revolution after the war, were stuck with huge tax bills on their property. The state of Massachusetts was terribly in debt from fighting the war and figured it would go to its citizenry to pay those debts. Those people were going to lose their farms and decided to protest and actually faced their state militia and were gunned down in the similar fashion to the regulators 2 decades before. But this indicated for people like James Madison that the articles were ultimately flawed and would not be able, as they were, to help have a functioning nation. So in 1786, after the Shays' Rebellion, we see what is called the Annapolis Convention. And that Annapolis Convention was basically organized by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. They invite representatives from every state to come to deal with the revisions of the articles, as they're calling it. 5 states show up. So they can't even get a quorum to actually do what they want to do. And so Hamilton and Madison come back to the drawing board and decide that they need to have some other meeting. And they decide to do this in Philadelphia. They invite all 13 states. Again, 12 show up. Rhode Island did not. But their purpose was to revise this Articles of Confederation. On day one, Madison puts it out there that he would like to move on to not attempting to revise this document, but write a new plan of government. Obviously, the people who attended, the vast majority of them understood this was the intention, that they were going to be writing a new plan of government. How did this get passed? Well, ultimately, because Madison was able to convince George Washington to come and be part of this experience. On the first day, he is made the president of the convention. And the fact that he was willing to risk his life and his fortune to lead the Continental Army during the war, and now was willing to come out of retirement once again because he saw the need for some type of better plan of government. That's really what created the cohesiveness and the ability for these men over the course of 3 months to literally build a new plan of government. This new constitution is not going to be Confederate. It is going to be a federal model. You are going to have a national government and then these state governments that will balance each other in terms of power. They will have different responsibilities, and then they will have some that are exactly the same. But you can see as of 1790, we have some states with tremendously large populations like Virginia and Pennsylvania, and then we have others that are relatively small like Delaware and Rhode Island. And that is why we begin to have multiple plans about things like representation during the period of building this Constitution. Virginia was the equivalent of what California or Texas is today. They have populations so much larger than the average state. And the question was, well, how are we going to do representation? Under the Articles of Confederation, every state had a representative and an equal representation. Was that going to stay the same when we created our new plan of government? And through much debate, we get to something called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. But it's because we have two factions. We have the smaller populated states like New Jersey and Delaware saying we just need one representative or equal representation for all 13 states. For states like Virginia that had twice as much population as the next biggest state, they said, well, wait a minute, we have other responsibilities, and ultimately we have a lot of the population. Shouldn't we have a greater voice? And in the end, we get what we have today, which is we have a lower house, the House of the People, which is based on population in terms of proportional representation. And then we have our Senate, which is our upper house, which at one time was the House of the States as it was known, and that is going to be equal representation for every state. And between the two and the ability to write bills, have reconciliation, that both have to agree in this lawmaking process before it goes to the president, that is how we were going to have this federal model work. So there's going to be some other issues as well. So for those of you who know your Enlightenment thinkers well, you know that of the many ideas that were percolating during this constitutional convention, there was a concern about, well, how do you balance the power and check the power within the national government? And that's going to come about by having three branches. We're going to have now a judiciary. We're going to have an executive. We're going to have a legislative branch. Under the Articles, we really just had the legislative branch. So now we're going to have three different facets of government, each with different powers, each able to check the other. But people did wonder about the executive. Who was this person going to be? Was this going to be like a king? For the people sitting in Philadelphia, obviously, day after day, they were looking at George Washington. He was unanimously elected to be the first president of the United States. So when we look at Article 2 in the Constitution, we can see ultimately they were creating their vision was based on this man. So we talk about the roles of the president. Certainly, they have changed over time. George Washington saw himself, and it was seen by others as he was going to be commander-in-chief. So the head of the military service when needed. He was also the head of state. So he would speak with other nations if perhaps that was needed, but certainly was seen as someone who was going to be the leader of the nation, the head of the government. There were other parts of this role, though, that he wasn't necessarily up for, in particular being the chief diplomat and being the chief legislature, which is what we see the president doing quite a bit of today. And he was able to handle that issue by creating what he called a cabinet. So it doesn't actually use the word cabinet in the Constitution in Article 2, but it says that the president may select by approval of the Senate some advisors. And so that's what George Washington did. So his first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson, because he'd already filled the role of being an ambassador to both England and France. He was someone who was multilingual. He was pen pals with the Tsarina of Russia. He knew everybody, it seemed. And so he was the perfect choice for that role. In order to help shape legislation, that goes to Alexander Hamilton, who will be our first Secretary of the Treasury, and will heavily influence, certainly in the early 1790s, what will be much of the lawmaking that takes place. We also have the issue of how do we elect the executive? And the idea of the Electoral College came about really in two ways. One, it was to address this issue of large states and small states, and how could small states have more authority when it came to selecting the president. So the standard that we have today with the Electoral College remains unchanged. The only difference is it's capped today at 538 electors. But that Electoral College compromise is one in which we have elites also being able to put the brakes on the idea that you're going to have a popular election alone choose the presidency. That was something they were not comfortable with. They felt essentially you needed other kinds of leadership to help broker that process. So when we speak about the United States as a republic, that is why. If we were truly a purely democracy, we would have the people making all decisions, and we would not have this system where we have both proportional and equal representation that we do today. So representation in terms of our voting power is the key concept here. We're also going to have other compromises that are going to be made during this Constitutional Convention, in particular over the issue of slavery. So it's important to note that from the time that we are creating the government, the future government under which we still all live, people were conscious of the fact that slavery was an issue that would require resolution. At this point, people are compromising, and some of those compromises will come back to haunt the United States for the next 6 decades and ultimately lead to the Civil War. In particular, you're going to see that 3/5 compromise. That is going to help states like South Carolina have tremendous representation for people who will never vote, people who were not free, people who were not legally considered people. So slave states are going to have tremendous power in Congress until the era of the Civil War because of this 3/5 compromise. And they are going to insist that slaves be counted as part of the census in terms of determining representation. For those who were anti-slavery, for those who just recognized that slavery was going to continue to be a problem, they didn't wish to give into this. And so that is where we get that 3/5 number. That itself was the compromise. There were other compromises made as well. Northern states in particular, again, abolitionists, they wanted to make sure that the importation of slaves, this international slave trade, would have a finite end. It would stop at some point. And so 1808 being the end of the international slave trade. But that does not speak to the internal slave trade, which will continue to grow, or the fact that we will have natural increase, as they called it. So slaves who are having children who are slaves, who are having children who are slaves. And so the slave population is going to continue to grow in the United States tremendously long after the importation of slavery ends in 1808. Again, the compromise that's made for this 1808 banning of the slave trade is that there will be a fugitive slave clause that will be recognized. So with the original Constitution, a slave who ran away to another state, a state that was a free state, and there were 2 of those by the time this Constitutional Convention takes place, those people were not truly free. However, that is going to be a social construct that continues to exist up through the eve of the Civil War, that you will have slaves who run away to free states in order to live freely. And unless someone captures them or brought them to court to bring them back to their original slave state, they lived free, but with this idea that at any moment they could be put back in slavery. But there was a fugitive slave clause going all the way back to the creation of our U.S. Constitution. You can see from our map here that we are going to begin to see divisions within the American public. So there are going to be those, particularly in the northern states, the coastal cities, who like this new plan of government. On the last day of the convention, as they are going to ratify, to put this in order to then send it to the states, you have lots of people who are now starting to say, I like the Constitution. I like that we've created our Article 1 and we have all these powers, but also restrictions on Congress. In Article 2, we've defined the executive. In Article 3, we've decided that we're going to have some kind of national judiciary. And that the Constitution ultimately is going to be the supreme law of the land. However, what about individual rights? What about this idea that Locke, that we've been espousing, that each man is endowed by his creator with certain inalienable rights? That's not included in this Constitution. So that creates what will become two factions. You will have a faction that are Federalists. They are going to be the people, many of whom helped shape this Constitution, like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who are going to say the Constitution is great as it is. They're going to write lots of documents that they'll publish to encourage people in their states to ratify this Constitution, or those Federalist Papers as they're known. You're also going to have anti-Federalists. You're going to see a lot of those in the West, certainly more in the South. Those are going to be people who say, no, we fought this revolution for the purposes of these higher principles. We want these principles codified. By the time we get to 1789, we still have some very large states that are refusing to ratify. We certainly will get 9 of the 13, which is what was required for the Constitution to go into effect. But someone like James Madison said, you know what, we really need all 13 states to agree. And so ultimately, that is what is going to create this Bill of Rights in order to make sure that in late 1788, New York and Virginia will ratify this Constitution and then get the other 4 to follow. That is how the Bill of Rights becomes added. So the anti-Federalists, in the sense, win that debate. But those Federalist Papers are certainly persuasive to a particular audience. They were not necessarily written for the average man. They were written in support of the Constitution for people who would have been probably professionals, people who might have actually been elected members to their state governments, in order for them to go out and be able to have talking points and encourage their citizenry to vote to ratify the Constitution. There were documents that were oppositional, which collectively sometimes people call the Anti-Federalist Papers. People like George Mason, Patrick Henry are 2 of those individuals who contribute to those particular papers. But the Bill of Rights, lots of states already had bills of rights. So a good example would be Virginia, where George Mason came from, and Patrick Henry. So the idea that these were just kind of created out of thin air is not correct. There already was an establishment, at least at the state level, that individual rights would be codified in some way. And you can see Delaware is going to be one of our first states to ratify. Some of our larger, more populous states like Virginia and New York, it will take them quite a while to ratify. Rhode Island, which didn't even want to participate in that constitutional convention, they will be the last state to ratify. And you can see with our pictures here that are changing those images that people often use pillars to represent in artwork what would be the states, and said that we had what we called a federal edifice. So what is going to hold up the structure? It's going to be each of these states ratifying that Constitution. And that was a popular motif in terms of encouraging people to think about the importance of ratifying this Constitution for our new plan of government. Our biggest turning points in this time period, between 1763 and 1787, One, the proclamation line, because it is one of many things that contributes to this idea that British imperial authority is increasing after the French and Indian War, and that the colonists are having limits put on their ideas of individual liberty and self-government. In 1776, we're a year into the fighting of what will be the Revolutionary War, but certainly the creation of the Declaration of Independence will be the document that finally sets us on the trajectory of being the United States of America. Within a year, we have to have a plan of government now that we're our own country. That becomes our Articles of Confederation. Obviously, it's short-lived. Within a decade, it's gone. But what were the flaws of the Confederation, and why do we replace it with this federal model, with the Constitutional Convention of 1787? And then why was that not enough? Why did we have to then have a Bill of Rights? And obviously, we've continued to amend the Constitution 17 more times since the original ratification of the Bill of Rights. But those turning points, those are things to think about. Make sure that you can recognize as we are beginning to move towards the point in the unit where we begin to test. So as we close out, make sure that you understand some principles for why the American Revolution was fought. So those Enlightenment principles, go back and review those. Who are the people? What are the major events, the documents, the laws from this time period of 1763 all the way to 1787 that are going to be turning points? They are going to be the reasons why we have an independence movement, why we create our own nation, and why it is an attempt to create what the founders called a more perfect union in the decade once we begin to be an independent nation. And then to kind of consider, of the principles of the American Revolution it was fought for, do the Articles or do the Constitution best reflect those principles? Why? Explain. So that's our lesson today. Again, as always, please make sure you ask questions, especially as we look at our kind of our big closeout questions, things that you can't answer or other additional questions you have, please ask when we see each other again on Zoom.